Hello, friends. Trisha Goyer here. And I will have to say, one of my favorite returning people is here. So, Mike House is here. Mike, I have loved it when you've come and talked about your books. Um, we've had Barabbas on here, you talking about that. And
Yep.
now we have a new one, Sophia. So, first of all, welcome. And for those who maybe haven't caught some of our other interviews, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, I chose a different career when I was in college because I thought that would be safer.
Yeah.
And so I went into corporate finance and business for a long time. I almost became a lawyer. That's a little
Oh,
scary.
wow.
So I did that for about 25 years and then had an opportunity to step back and semi-retire
Mm.
and focus on books. So I had done a little bit of writing over the years, but not a lot. And now I'm just living my best life, working part-time for a company in Chicago and doing a little bit of traveling here and there, and then writing books and going to different shows now. And I went to Realm Makers where I got to see
Yes.
you. That was fun.
We gotta have lunch together at Realm Makers, which is
That's right.
awesome.
That was right. Yep. And that was a lot of fun. I met some really neat people there. I met
Yeah.
a guy who was retired. He just retired. He's young. He's younger than me, but he's already retired from the Air Force. He was a pilot.
Oh, wow.
And that was a lot of fun conversations because we have a son in the Army who's an officer, and he's now in captain school. And so we got to talk a little bit about Army bureaucracy and Air Force bureaucracy and all the fun things.
Yeah, I love it. I love going to the conferences, and I mean, I enjoy the workshops, I enjoy learning, I enjoy, just getting those ideas, but meeting the people and having lunch, like, we were able to sit there and we've been
Yeah,
able to talk online, and then we get to talk face
yeah,
to face, and then just the people I meet, it's so amazing because I feel like, oh, these are my people. We could all talk the same language about books and about writing and about characters
yeah,
and about our imagination, which also realm makers, if they have like sci-fi and fantasy and kind of other elements.
right,
And I
right.
know that Sophia has, there's a little bit of just not your straight story. So
Right.
start by telling us about Sophia and then how did
Good.
you get the idea? First of all, the cover is amazing also. But how did you get the idea for this?
Well, it's not sci-fi.
It's not sci-fi. It's not sci-fi.
It
There's no
obviously has some
spaceships.
supernatural elements to it,
Mhm.
as does the New Testament, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yes, the
right,
Bible, like throughout the Bible.
the Bible and our
The witch
most
of Endor. I mean, there's
yeah,
so many things.
and our most accurate, in fact, scholars say this now, our most accurate historical document from that time period of the New Testament is the New Testament.
Mhm.
They weren't just making up stories
Right.
around principles they wanted to teach. These things really happened. And so a lot of the things that, for instance, the Apostle Paul describes were
Mhm.
real things that happened. The Council at
Yeah.
Jerusalem and his shipwreck on Melita and all kinds of things. We find more and more evidence of these things as we go on. So it's been a lot of fun to work through that. So I did the Barabbas trilogy,
Yes.
and then I promised a few folks that I would follow up with some spin-offs.
Hmm.
And I wasn't sure when I started book 3 what that first spin-off would be. I figured it would be one of the sons. But then I got near the end of the Barabbas Legacy, which is book 3, and I brought the youngest daughter into the mix and got to know her character a little bit. And by the end, I was like, okay, she's it. She's the first spin-off because she's a
Basically, she
oh
wasn't
yeah,
gonna let the boys get the attention.
that's
She
right. And she's a spitfire and she's a preacher and she was going to take it to the world. So I said, okay, that's what it is.
Mhm.
And of course there was a dramatic ending to the Barabbas legacy that I don't know that I want to give away. And
Yeah,
that lets us know that she's probably the one that's going to be the first
right.
spin-off. So and indeed she is. And then I'll probably do at least one more spin-off.
Oh, good.
But I'm busy doing lots of other things too, including, working on movie scripts and different things. So
That's so fun that, like, all this time, I mean, you have obviously have that creative nature in you, this draw for stories. I mean, if we're not crazy and drawn to this, we would not be doing this because it's a lot of
Yeah,
work. It's
yeah,
a lot of work, especially you're doing historical fiction, so
mhm,
there's research, but then it's exciting storylines and these,
yeah.
spiritual elements. I mean, there's a lot of layers that go on, and so if it wasn't in you, it's not something you would naturally be drawn to do.
And
So
you
I
yeah,
love yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. Oh, I was just gonna say, you have to be wired a
Yeah.
little bit differently to write creative fiction. Like,
Mhm.
I have a brother who's brilliant, has a PhD in microbiology. He was a great resource during COVID, right? I could ask
Oh, I
him all
bet.
kinds of interesting questions. And he says he has sat down to try and write fiction. He cannot do it. It just
Mhm.
it doesn't work for him. He's not
Yeah.
wired that way.
Yeah.
And so you do have to be wired a little bit that way. And then, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to use our talents to do
Mhm.
good. That's what we should be doing,
Yep.
right? Because our job is to prepare this world for Christ's return. It's
Mhm.
not to sit back and wait for it to happen. It's to actively prepare for his return. And that's what he's expecting us to do.
Yeah. And what I love about that, and especially the books that you write, is that some people, like, they wouldn't sit down and listen to us preach a sermon to them.
Mhm.
They wouldn't if we wrote a list of all our favorite scripture verses and hand it to them, they might just crumple it up. But a story where you
Yeah,
can have these events and, like, what if this happened? And so
oh, sure.
your stories aren't like, "This is exactly how it was in scripture." But
Well,
there's elements of truth throughout it
oh,
of
absolutely.
of this is how people lived and this is things that could have happened. So talk a little bit about that as you take this is we have our biblical narrative and
Mhm.
then we have all these characters because you know what happened to this person? What happened to that person who her son is being carried to the funeral and all of a sudden, he's raised alive. I mean,
Sure.
there's so many people that
Oh, yeah.
have amazing stories that we don't get to know, and so I love that you took one that you don't
Yeah,
hear anything about, Barabbas, and then you continue, now you have a spinoff. So what is it like taking this truth of God's word, but also making it so readers will be interested and care about these characters and also learn about God and his ways as
yeah.
they're reading through the books?
Yeah, and I guess my first response to that would be that it has a lot to do with following the Spirit. This
Mhm.
was a story that particularly captured me,
Yeah.
Barabbas. What
Mhm.
was it like for him? What was it like from his perspective? What did he do? We don't know.
Yeah.
And and then I ran with it. Different stories impact different people in different ways,
Mhm.
right? And so someone else might be really attracted by, the group of friends who lowered their other friend who was sick through the roof so that Jesus could heal him.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe they think that's a really cool story. I want to write about that group
Mhm.
of friends. And that could be a great story. We don't know
Yeah.
anything about them either, right?
Ooh, and now both of us are like, who's
Yeah.
gonna get to that story first?" No, just kidding.
Oh, and one I was just thinking about the other day was, David, King David had this. Now before he became king of all Israel,
Yeah.
he had this group of 600.
Yes!
And I think they called them the mighty ones.
The mighty men of valor.
And they were his core group of elites that,
Uh-huh.
one, kept him alive, and two, helped him then attain the throne of all Israel. And they built a special house for them in Jerusalem once he moved to Jerusalem. And the Bible names a lot of them. And so you could go through and pick a name
And
and
if
say,
you
I
look
want
at
to write
some of
this story.
those, it'd be like, he killed 100 people with the shaft of a
Oh,
whatever.
sure,
And it's you're
sure.
like, why isn't more of this story in here? Because this is really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all these amazing people.
And you could make one of them Uriah the Hittite's best friend,
Yeah.
because Uriah was one of them.
I know, isn't
And
that
he was the
crazy?
husband of Bathsheba. So
Yeah,
there's lots of really fun connections you can make there. And
I
different
love
people
that.
are going to find different ones that really strike them. Now, the folks that created The Chosen, Dallas Jenkins and crew, boy, they
Mhm.
really struck a golden vein, right? In
Mhm.
how they tell the story.
Mhm.
They didn't want to tell it in Old English, and they didn't want to
Yeah.
just use a really maybe stultifying script. They wanted to make it look real and
Mhm.
help people get into the experience and feel
Mhm.
like they're
Mhm.
there. And goodness, they've succeeded. They've done a
Yes.
tremendous job. They're very good at their craft.
Yeah.
and they're trying to tell a story, like you said, but they're staying true to the
Mhm.
principles of the
Mhm.
gospel, and it is helping a lot of people open
Yeah,
their eyes to those
yeah.
principles, and it's wonderful, wonderful to see.
Yeah, I love that, and I love that, as you're exploring these characters and
Mhm.
the spiritual messages that are going through the books, you're also, like, giving us an insight into what it was like to live during that time, and
Sure.
it was not easy, like, and they had to flee, and there's all these obstacles, and they're in parts of the world they never expected to be in, and there's
Oh, yeah.
situations, and so I think it's so fascinating that I think so many times we have this little tiny view of the Bible, and it just happened around Jerusalem and everything that's going on there.
Yeah.
But no, like when you read about, yeah, they had to scatter because of persecution and so many other things. Um, and you give us a glimpse of what it would have been like during that time, and yet they were
Mhm.
faithful.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's so important about Christian fiction and then historical fiction and especially biblical fiction. We often say, "Oh, the world has never been this horrible," and I'm
Yeah.
like, Look at what people had to go through." I mean, I'm sitting here, we're talking.
Yeah.
We live thousands of miles away. We're talking over the
Yeah.
computer. I have running water. It just gives you a glimpse of life, but God's faithfulness to them, it's the same as God's faithfulness to us now. And I think we can learn and grow. So, as you were writing Sophia, let's talk about Sophia for a minute. What
Sure.
were some of the things that Sophia taught you about maybe faith or about God or about relationships?
Well, one of the things is being ready to take advantage of the opportunities that the Lord gives you.
Mhm.
You might have a plan for your life, and as you read Sophia, you'll see that she's coming up with a plan for the rest of her life,
Mhm.
and it ends up being different than what the Lord really intends for her.
Yeah.
She wants to do good, her plan is fine, but the Lord knows a lot more than we do,
Mhm.
and I've seen that
Mhm.
a lot, obviously, in my life.
Yeah.
I make my plans, I do my best, that's all He asks of us, is to do our best, but then we need to be willing to let Him, because He's not gonna force us, to let
Right,
Him make
right.
some course corrections and change the plan a little bit and say,
Yeah.
"Here's what you get to go do now," right? Not have to do, get to do.
Yeah.
And it always turns out a lot better than anything we could have dreamed up ourselves, to be
And it's
honest.
not that the plans are easy either.
Right,
So, the thing he calls us to do, I'm in the middle of it. We're like, "Why are we having to face this?"
right,
And
right.
then afterwards, we're like,
Yeah,
"Oh, I see." Like, "Oh,
yeah,
you knew what you were doing all along. I don't know why I'm so surprised here."
yeah.
And
Well, the
I
people
love that.
back in so this one takes place about 72 to 82 AD.
Mhm.
And those people, I mean, you mentioned the technology differences, and so their life was harder, right? The basics were harder.
Right.
But the politics and the interpersonal
Mhm.
relationships, all that stuff was the same. The human
Yeah.
condition and the human experience really isn't any different now than it
The
was
sin
then.
nature, the sin
All the
natures.
temptations are the same,
Yeah.
all the pitfalls are the same.
Mhm.
And it's really interesting to see some of the history. And one of the interesting things to think about is, the Lord comes and He establishes His church, but He doesn't tell them to just stay in one place
Mhm.
and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
He says, "No, go all over the world, as far as you can go, as fast as you can go." It was an
Yeah.
amazing missionary program that the world had never seen before.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And in fact, in some cases, the members were probably like, "Wait a minute, let's slow down, right?
Mhm.
We're going
Mhm.
too fast." But the Lord was here for all of us. He wanted to. His
Mm.
purpose is to save the world, and so they went everywhere. And so they had to start dealing with all the different religions and the cultures and the politics and of course the Roman Empire
Yeah.
controlled most of where they went, but
Mhm.
not all of it. And so
Right.
in Sophia, they go up into Sarmatia, which was outside of the Roman Empire. And we know that, for instance, Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, went to India. In fact, it's said that he probably died in India. Well, that was not
That's
part of the Roman
amazing.
Empire either, right?
Right, right.
So they were going everywhere they could to spread the gospel. And
Mm.
and so Sophia gets to travel. So we've seen Barabbas, and he travels around primarily with the Apostle Paul, and he interacts with a few other apostles like Peter.
Right.
But then Sophia gets to travel with the youngest apostle, I should
Mm.
say the youngest original apostle, and that was John, the brother of James. And she travels around with John and wonders how he has so much energy, because there's different theories about how he died, or if he didn't die, or
Right,
if he was
right.
translated like Moses or whatever it was, right? And she's like, why do you have so much energy? And he just keeps going, right? And there's a
Mm,
little bit of foreshadowing in the book about some of the things that later happened to him, right? He was exiled eventually to the
yeah.
island of Patmos. That actually happens after this time frame. There's also stories about how he was thrown into a vat of boiling oil by Emperor Domitian
That does
and
not sound
escaped,
fun.
and just came right out, right? And he was
Yeah,
fine. So there's that out there too. And again, that
yeah.
happened after the time frame of this book. But it was fun to bring to life John, who's a
Mm,
little bit
yeah,
different than Peter, and who's a little bit different than Paul. And we don't know exactly what they were like, but they all wrote quite a bit.
yeah, yeah.
And then one of the things that happens in the book is Sophia gets to become his scribe for some things.
Mm,
A lot of the apostles had scribes. They had people write things for them, like Paul's epistle to the Romans was written by, I think it was Tychicus,
right.
and sent by Phoebe, sent with Phoebe, who was a female leader of the church from, I think you pronounce it Cenchrea, and she's the one that took that letter to Rome before he had even visited Rome. Right? He wanted to
Wow.
go to Rome, and he sent this letter, and he commended the Roman saints for their faithfulness. And then eventually, not in the way he had intended, but eventually he got to Rome, right, as a prisoner.
Mhm. Yeah, not the way he intended it at all.
Yeah, fascinating
But
story.
God used that. Again, God used that.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And then there's different theories about how Paul died, and I don't ascribe to the most popular ones, but I'm not going to say anything more on that either. So,
Yeah. Well, okay, so what I love, okay, so we have, these are fictional characters, but the things that really happened during that time, and I do want to go back because someone might be saying maybe they're new to the Bible, maybe they're like, who is this Barabbas guy that you're
sure.
talking about? Maybe they haven't watched the video, so let's talk a little bit about that too, because not
Yeah,
only did you pick interesting people, you picked like a person that was totally impacted, the first person that's completely impacted by Jesus' sacrifice. Like this is
absolutely.
he received freedom before
Yeah,
anyone else. So just explain a little bit. Maybe there's someone that's listening that doesn't even know about that.
yeah,
Share who Barabbas is and how you were able to use the story. Because of course, yes,
sure.
please go get Sophia, but also
Yeah.
the other books you want to be sure to check out those too.
Well, we're certain that Barabbas was real. All
Mhm.
four writers of the Gospels mention him.
Yeah.
Josephus mentions him. So we know he was real, and we know he was killed in place of Christ.
Mhm.
And his
Or
liberation was,
Christ was killed in place in his place.
oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I said
yeah.
that backwards.
You
Sorry.
said that backwards. He lived,
Christ was
Barabbas
killed in
lived.
place of him.
Yeah.
And he was liberated in a completely unexpected way to him. He was
Mhm.
preparing to die. And if you've read some of the accounts of people who have, here's a book I recommend, highly recommend to people, and this is nonfiction, and this is a book called "Live Not by Lies,"
Okay,
and
we're
it's by
writing this
Rod
down.
Dreher. "Live Not by Lies."
We're gonna put it in the comments, okay.
Yep. And I think Angel Studios, now they were the ones that backed The Chosen. I think Angel Studios is going to back the documentary on this book,
Oh,
Live
wow,
Not by
okay.
Lies. And what it's about is this Rod Dreher went and interviewed some of the survivors of the religious persecutions behind the Iron Curtain
Oh,
back in the
wow.
50s, 60s, and
Uh-huh.
70s. And some of their stories are absolutely amazing. And they're telling in part their own stories, their own personal experiences, and the experiences of others they knew, some of which died in prison, some of which were tortured to death, etc.
You know, I think I bought this book because I think I met the granddaughter of one of the people in the
Oh,
book.
okay.
I'm
Yeah,
pretty
yeah,
sure.
yeah. But it's fabulous. And and these people they get thrown in prison and they think they're going to die. And that was Barabbas's plight, right?
Mhm.
He was
Mhm.
probably a Jewish rebel. He
Yeah.
had probably killed Romans. They hated him, which made it harder for Pilate to give him up, quite frankly. They hated him.
Well, yeah, and which is also what the Jewish people were looking for. They're looking for that strong warrior who's gonna come in and free
Yeah,
them from the Romans.
Right. But think about if you're in prison and you've prepared yourself mentally to die.
Mhm, mhm.
You're ready for it. Okay, it's gonna happen. And then this happens to people when, accidents happen or illness
Right,
happens and
right.
they reach a point, and some of it I know for sure is the Lord preparing them to die,
Mhm,
helping them
mhm, mhm.
prepare to cross over to the other side. That's real. But then all of a sudden he's thrown out onto the street. He's free.
Yeah,
And that had to have been just a shock to his
yeah,
system,
yeah,
right? So how did he deal with that?
yeah.
He probably had heard of Jesus of Nazareth, probably didn't know much about him, but he had a choice to make, which is the same choice we
Mm,
have to make. Do I
yeah,
find out more or do I not just go off on
yeah,
my way and do wherever the world takes me, right?
mhm.
And a lot of people do that. I'm just going to go wherever the world takes me and do what feels good, and then most of the time that they end up in really bad places. I'll give you an example, and you've probably heard of this guy. He barely blossomed here. Oliver Anthony. Have you heard that name?
No, I haven't.
And he released a song called "Rich Men North of Richmond"
I think
about, I don't know, 3 weeks ago,
okay.
and it hit number one on the iTunes charts for music. Just came
I'm
out
ta
of nowhere.
I'm taking care of kids, I'm driving to basketball practice. I don't know these songs. I'm gonna look that one up though.
Oliver Anthony, and he's a guy. He calls himself an idiot with a guitar.
Oh,
And he's a guy who dropped out of high school at 17 and worked a bunch of blue collar jobs, around West Virginia, North Carolina, and those areas, and got hurt once, and got into some bad things and some drinking and some drugs, and just found himself in some really bad places. And finally, he'd been brought up in church, he'd gone to church, had read the
mm,
Bible a little bit, but had really, you know, forsaken it.
yeah.
He came back to it and he said, I think I don't want to just die. I think there's things I need to do. He had this feeling that he had
Wow,
things to do, and he turned to God, and he started making this music, and
wow,
he's just been catapulted to the top of the charts. Like you've heard
wow.
of what's his name? Is it John Rich, the famous country singer? Am I getting his first name wrong? Anyway, so I mean, he's helping him now,
I'm telling
and
you, I'm driving kids to basketball practice.
yeah.
I don't
And
know.
so here's this guy who turns himself over to God, just not thinking
Yeah,
this is ever going to
so
happen. And
cool.
and he's all of a sudden, making lots of money now, but selling, lots of
Mhm.
people are listening to his music, and he's on the Joe Rogan podcast this weekend.
Wow,
So
so cool.
amazing things can happen, right?
It's
If
like,
you
yeah,
decide to make that choice to turn to Christ.
yeah. God has plans for us, and I always thought when we had our kids, they're almost like empty vessels, and we have to fill them up with all the things, and we're gonna do
Yeah.
music and dance and sports
Yep.
and all this stuff. No, there are now that I have 10 kids, so
Yeah.
their personalities there, God has
Oh,
plans for
sure.
them and dreams for them, and you
Oh,
can
yeah.
see, like, the things little that you're like, "This is really annoying," is gonna be the thing that God uses in their
Yeah.
future.
Yeah.
So, I just love that, and it's so true from all the people in the Bible. I mean, I can't wait, like, someday in eternity, we can just sit down and listen, like, "Oh, you were one of the 5,000.
Yeah.
Tell me your story," you know? It's just
Yeah.
gonna be amazing, and I love that you took Barabbas and now you're doing these spinoffs. Okay, so you mentioned
Mhm.
Sophia.
Yep.
What are the titles of the Barabbas trilogy?
So
And I
I
have them
was
around here somewhere, I just did not grab them.
Yep, they're called I Was Called Barabbas, that's book 1,
Mhm,
and then Pillars of Barabbas
mhm.
is book 2, and that's when he gets to go to Rome,
Yep.
and that's when Paul gets to talk to Emperor Nero. There's some fun conversations there. And then book 3 is the Barabbas Legacy, and in the Barabbas Legacy, we see the year of 4 emperors, where
Mhm.
you have Galba, then Otho, then Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian becomes emperor, and he stays emperor for 10 years.
Yeah.
And then in Sophia, the emperor is Vespasian for most of the time, but then his son Titus takes over when he dies, and then
Okay.
Titus only lasts a couple of years, and then
Yeah.
Domitian takes over. And a lot of people thought Titus would be the bad one, but
Mm.
he was more like his father. I think Vespasian ruled in a fairly even-handed manner, and
Right.
and didn't persecute the church much.
Mhm.
And I think Titus was the same way. It appears he was the same way, and Domitian was the bad one. He was really bad. He's the one that persecuted John, right?
Oh, man.
And so they experience all of this, and that in book 3 of the series, you also see the siege of Jerusalem, which maybe killed close to 1 million people, and
That's so
it
overwhelming,
effectively
yeah.
ended the Jewish state. The Jewish state was no more. In fact, the Romans started calling it by other names, and you'll see that in Sophia. They
Wow.
didn't call the city Jerusalem anymore. They called it, oh gosh, now I don't remember the name. It was a name that begins with an A. And they called,
Wow.
yeah, the land of Judea was called Palestine. They changed
Yeah.
it. They
Wow.
started calling it Palestine because they had defeated the Jewish rebellion. They defeated the Jews. And to
Wow.
press that point home, the Romans changed some of the names.
Wow.
And then, or I should say, Israel didn't exist again as a country until 1948, almost 2,000
Yeah.
years later.
Yeah, that's so amazing. I love
And then,
that
yep, go ahead.
so much history in these novels. It's just so
Yeah.
cool.
And they get to see, they get to see, of course, Vespasian dies. And then shortly after that, or right after that, Mount Vesuvius erupts.
I know.
And
So
and
cool.
I actually put them in a boat near the shore,
Oh my
passing by,
word.
just for fun, right? To see the eruption of
Yeah.
the volcano. And then of course, people organized to help. And
Yeah.
Titus, he actually sent a couple, we know this, he sent a couple of legions, full legions down to help with the recovery efforts around Pompeii. So
Wow.
there's some fascinating history there as well.
Okay, so you have the 3, you have Sophia. Do you know what other spinoff you're gonna do next?
I don't. I don't know, and in fact, I was
Mm.
thinking there's a guy that comes from book 1 or maybe book 2, named Dan, who's a Greek who actually was a rebel, part of um, the Spartans,
Oh, yeah.
and that heritage, and and he converts and has his family. And I thought, well, maybe one of his children, because I introduced some of his children
Right.
before. Also Cornelius, some of his children.
Oh,
You
yeah.
still got Barabbas's children. So there's a lot to choose from. Cornelius is a fun character to write about. He doesn't appear in Sophia, but he appears in all 3 of the Barabbas books,
Well,
as does Paul.
that you're gonna wake up one morning and, like, it's gonna be there. The story's gonna be there, you're gonna know what to write, and you're gonna get to work.
Well, the other thing that I thought would be interesting is to keep progressing through history, right? So I've only made it to about
Mhm.
82 AD, but the history after that is fascinating as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
And if I could ever get all the way to about 320 or so AD, that would be a lot of fun. You
You
know,
might need to start skipping, like, generations pretty soon to
and
get
then
there.
after that, yeah, then after that, I'd probably skip a bunch more, and
Yeah.
it would be fun. It'd be fun to write about some of the Reformation as well.
Oh, I know.
And I mean, it's sad that a Reformation was ever needed. But one of the interesting things that happens in Sophia is, so Jerusalem has been destroyed, right? And the Jewish state is
Mhm.
dissolved, essentially. A lot of the saints escaped, we think, and they moved to a place called Pella, which you can find today, not named Pella, but in modern day
Mm.
Jordan. So that place is in modern day Jordan. And you think, well, okay, the headquarters of the church would have migrated to Pella, right?
Yeah.
Well, it didn't. It doesn't seem to have. It seems that it eventually migrated to Rome, that Rome
Oh,
became the
wow.
epicenter of the church.
Well, that makes
And
sense because there's so many Christians there
yeah,
later.
and the Roman saints were very faithful, and Rome was obviously the seat of political power. And so maybe there was a reason that the other apostles decided to move the headquarters there. And of course, in the book, you see other apostles die, and some of them most of them violently. But
Wow.
I mean, that was happening as well.
Mhm.
So think about that as members of the church at the time. You got the 12 apostles, and then they get killed, and they get replaced generally. But then at one point, they stopped being replaced, and that's another
Yeah.
interesting story. What happened, right?
Mhm.
And then eventually you needed some sort of a reformation. And so that's when you get people like um, William Tyndale,
Yep,
who
and
we call,
my
yeah, go ahead.
ancestor, John Rogers,
John
um,
Rogers, John
finished
Wycliffe. Yeah,
finished the Tyndale book for
mhm,
him, finished the
mhm,
Matthew's Bible.
absolutely.
So he's my, 8th great grandfather?
Yeah.
13th great grandpa something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
William Tyndale was amazing, and he
Yeah.
actually, I mean, I've read some of his quotes from other things that he wrote, not the Bible. He
Right,
wrote
right.
other things, other
Yeah.
tracks of
Yeah.
on different topics. And he said, "Look, if they," and they were burning his Bibles, right? They, the people that would find them, the authorities would find them, and they did because they didn't want people to read it in their
Right.
own language, which is silly, right? Christ wanted people to have the scriptures
Mhm.
that they could
Mhm.
study for themselves. That's what Christ wanted. But somehow, over the intervening centuries, those who led, quote unquote, the church decided, nope, we don't want the common people to see that, only the priests.
Yeah.
And so you
Which is
needed these
why a
reformers.
reformation was needed.
Yep, you needed those reformers to come in and say, no, we want the common people to have this. And he was being interviewed, and he said, well, I know they're burning the scriptures, and if they burn me too, so be it. I'm supposed to
Oh,
do this.
yeah.
And it did end up that he was burned, but not until after he was killed. So he
Mhm.
didn't have to die by fire, but his body
Mm.
was burned right after they killed him. So,
Wow, wow,
and then you get
so cool.
into, Martin Luther, and then later on, much later on, we've talked about this, Dietrich Bonhoeffer,
Yes.
and some of the courageous things he did.
Okay, Mike,
Amazing.
you need to get busy writing these books faster. You can't
Well,
do the
I'm
science.
trying to start fantasy and
Yeah,
keep my
you
science
can't do
fiction
the you
going.
can't do this fantasy and the science fiction. You have to put that off for a while. No,
I've
just
got
kidding.
a fantasy book written. I just
I
need to
know.
find a good home for it. And I
Yeah.
went to that Realm Makers conference, and one of the publishers I saw there was Enclave Publishing. So I thought, well,
Yes.
maybe I'll ship it off to them, but
There you go. Yeah, they're a good publisher.
we'll see. Yeah.
Very cool. All right, so we have Sophia. I'm gonna hold it up one more time, and then you gotta check out the Barabbas, and then the other books that you have written. Where can they go? Readers go to find you, find the books,
Yep.
connect with you, and get more information.
Well, you can find them in a lot of places because they're available on Ingram Spark, and then they're of course available through Amazon, and most of
Mhm.
them are in audio. There's a couple I'm working on right now to get the audio done. All the Barabbas books are on audio.
I need Sophia and
Sophia
audio.
isn't yet.
Okay.
Now,
Yeah.
I have found the voice artist for
Oh,
Sophia, and it's
good.
female. Of course, I had to find a female for this one, and so she's going to do that here shortly, and we'll have that one out on audio.
Oh, so good. Okay, make sure you check him out, and we love having Mike come when you finish your next one. Even your fantasy, we could talk about that. I'll be happy
Oh,
to.
I'd love to talk about the fantasy with you because it's going to involve Earth, and there will be some religion in it. It will go back to World War II Germany.
Yes.
Not by time travel, because I will
Oh,
not write time travel. I don't. I mean, I say that. Maybe I will someday, but
well, you're gonna wake up with the best time travel idea tomorrow just for saying that.
that's right. But I
But
mean, yeah, and it will hit a lot of powerful points about
I
how we live
remember
our
you
lives,
telling
how
me
we
about
believe in
that.
God, how we govern ourselves, all
Yeah.
those kinds of things, right?
So good. All right. Well, thank you, Mike, for being here. I always love it. Love what you're doing. I love that you're so creative. That you're like, oh, let's talk about sci-fi. Let's talk about
Well, thank
fantasy.
you.
Let's talk
You as
about.
well.
I
You
know.
as well. I know. I see
Fun.
you've got, I don't know, 2 or 3 that are coming out in short order, right?
I know. It's always crazy. But yeah, I enjoy it. Yeah, but thank you for being here today.
Thank you.